I had 60 seconds before the neurotoxin hit his heart and the assassins hit the floor. My fingers felt like lead as I scribbled onto the back of a cocktail napkin, the blue ink bleeding into the white paper like a bruise. Around me, the Sky Lounge hummed with the sterile, low-frequency vibration of the ultra-rich, the chime of silver against crystal, the scent of expensive orchids, and the hushed, treacherous murmur of the elite. Outside, the city lights below looked like distant embers, but in here, the air was cold, clinical, and smelled of the funeral arrangements I knew were coming. I approached table 1 like I was walking into my own grave. Lee Taeyong sat framed by the floor-to-ceiling glass, the skyline behind him looking like a throne he had conquered. He was terrifyingly beautiful, sharp, predatory features, hair like midnight, and a navy blue suit that cost more than my college tuition. His hands were folded on the table, but I could see the tremor, the first sign of the poison Lydia had just stirred into his wine with a smile. Beside him sat Lydia Gray. She looked like a masterpiece in her blood-red silk dress, her laughter sounding like wind chimes in a graveyard. To anyone else, she was the devoted fiancée. To me, she was a ghost. 10 minutes ago, I wasn't a savior. I was just a waitress in a sky-blue uniform stalking the service bar. I had been behind the frosted glass partition when I heard her voice, low, sharp, and dripping with venom. She wasn't speaking to Taeyong. She was on a burner phone, speaking a dialect of Korean I barely understood, but the tone was universal. Execution. I had watched through the glass as she tipped a tiny, translucent vial into his glass. "He won't be able to scream," she had whispered. "He won't even be able to blink when you walk through that door." Returning to the floor, the world shifted into a Dutch angle of terror. Everything clicked. 2 men in tactical black stood by the elevator, not security, but Lydia's cleanup crew. A third was at the bar, his hand resting too close to the bulge in his waistband. They were in position. Taeyong was a lion in a cage he hadn't realized was locked. I could have kept walking. I could have let the god of industry fall and kept my hands clean. But I remembered the corporate greed that had evicted my mother and the silence that had swallowed my family. I knew what it felt like to be a victim of the powerful. I wouldn't let him be a victim of a lie. I leaned over, my shadow falling across his navy lapel. As I refilled his water, I let the napkin slip under the base of the glass. My eyes met his, wide, dark, and suddenly realization-heavy as his neck muscles seized. "Don't drink. She poisoned you. They're here." Hello, story lovers. Before we continue, please hit the like and subscribe button to keep more of these stories going. Comment your name and where you are watching from. Let's continue. The slip of paper didn't just slide. It felt like a heavy stone cast into a still pool. As the base of the water glass settled over the napkin, Taeyong's eyes didn't move toward the note immediately. He remained fixed on Lydia, his expression a mask of stony patience, but I saw the terrifying shift in his biology. The rhythmic drumming of his fingers on the tablecloth stuttered, then stopped. A single drop of sweat rolled from his hairline, tracing the sharp line of his jaw before disappearing into the collar of his navy suit. I lingered, pretending to adjust the silver salt shaker, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Read it," I screamed internally. "Please just look down." Beside him, Lydia Gray reached out, her fingers, manicured and lethal, tracing the back of his hand. "Is the wine not to your liking, darling?" she asked, her voice a silk ribbon. "You've hardly touched it." Taeyong's eyes finally flickered. He looked down, not at the wine, but at the white corner of the napkin peeking from beneath his water glass. The realization didn't come with a gasp or a shout. It was a slow, agonizing dawning. I watched his pupils dilate until they swallowed the amber of his irises. He tried to pull his hand away from Lydia's touch, but his arm didn't obey. It stayed anchored to the table, a useless piece of meat and bone. The neurotoxin was settling in, turning his nervous system into a series of broken circuits. His gaze snapped up to mine. In that moment, the god of industry vanished. Behind the terrifying power of the Korean Mafia boss was a man staring at his own executioner. His lips parted, a desperate, microscopic tremor shaking his chin, but no sound came out. His vocal cords were already under lock and key. He was screaming with his eyes, a silent, primal roar of betrayal and terror as he realized his body had become his own tomb. Lydia's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold as she followed his gaze to me. She saw the napkin. She saw the truth. The air in the Sky Lounge seemed to vanish, replaced by the metallic tang of impending violence. Her eyes scanned the name tag at my chest. "Tyla," she said, her voice dropping the facade of sweetness, "I think you've overstayed your welcome at this table." At the bar, the man in the dark suit stood up. The two shadows by the elevator turned in unison, their hands disappearing into their jackets. Taeyong was still glued to the table, struggling to move, and before I knew it, Taeyong was frozen. His body slowly toppled over. Indeed, he was a statue of a king and about to be toppled, and I was the only thing standing between him and the red silk dress that smelled like a funeral. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. I stepped closer, my hand gripping the back of Taeyang's heavy velvet chair, and prepared to move the unmovable. The first shot didn't hit Taeyong. It shattered a magnum of crystal 3 tables away, showering the elite in glass and vintage sin. The room erupted in a symphony of high-pitched screams, but Taeyong remained hauntingly silent, his body locked in that navy suit like a statue caught in a storm. Lydia was already moving, sliding out of the booth with a predator's grace, her red dress swirling as she signaled the men by the elevator. She didn't look back at her fiancé. She didn't have to. She had already replaced him. "Move," I hissed, though I knew he couldn't. I lunged forward, grabbing the heavy frame of his velvet chair and tilting it back. Taeyang's weight was immense, dead, unyielding muscle, but adrenaline turned my panic into a jagged sort of strength. I shoved the chair toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen just as a second bullet hissed through the air, punching a hole in the glass wall where his head had been seconds before. The kitchen was a chaos of stainless steel and steam. Chefs were diving for cover as I dragged Taeyong past the prep stations. My eyes scrambled for an exit until they landed on the heavy, industrial laundry cart parked near the service line. It was overflowing with soiled, white linens. With a grunt that tore at my throat, I heaved his paralyzed frame out of the chair. He tumbled into the floor, and then two arranged him into the base of the cart, his head lolling back against the rim, his eyes still wide, still screaming, still trapped. I threw a mountain of tablecloths over him, burying the god of industry under a heap of polyester and starch. There, by the freezer, a voice barked from the dining room. The doors swung open. I saw the polished black shoes of the man from the bar. I didn't breathe. I grabbed the handle of the cart and sprinted toward the service corridor. The wheels groaned, one of them wobbling violently, creating a rhythmic clack-clack-clack that sounded like a ticking clock. My sky blue uniform was damp with sweat and splashed with sauce from a discarded tray, but I didn't stop. I reached the service elevator, a dented, gray metal box that smelled of industrial cleaner and old grease. I slammed my fist against the down button. The footsteps in the kitchen were getting closer, the heavy rhythm of men who didn't care about the collateral damage. The elevator doors groaned open with agonizing slowness. I shoved the cart inside, the metal rattling as it hit the back wall. Just as the doors began to slide shut, The man in the dark suit rounded the corner. Our eyes locked through the narrowing gap. He raised his suppressed pistol, the muzzle a dark, empty eye. The doors hissed shut. The jolt of the descent nearly knocked me off my feet. I collapsed against the cart, my hands shaking so hard I could barely feel them. Beneath the linens, a muffled, strained sound escaped Taeyong, a low, guttural vibration of a man trying to find his voice in a body that had betrayed him. We were dropping toward the basement, away from the sky and into the dark, and I realized I was no longer just a waitress. I was a getaway driver for a man who couldn't even blink. The basement parking garage was a cavern of damp concrete and flickering fluorescent hums. I hauled the laundry cart toward a sleek, matte-black behemoth of a car, a vehicle that looked less like transport and more like a weapon. My fingers fumbled with the key fob I'd fished from Taeyong's pocket, the chirp of the locks sounding like a gunshot in the hollow silence. With a desperate, straining heave, I rolled his deadweight frame into the passenger seat. His head fell back against the headrest, his eyes darting toward me with a frantic, liquid intensity. He was still in there, a prisoner in a navy blue suit, watching his life depend on a woman who usually spent her nights memorizing the difference between Chardonnay and Chablis. I scrambled into the driver's seat and stared at the dashboard. It was a terrifying cockpit of glowing screens and buttons without labels. I'd grown up taking the bus. My experience with internal combustion was limited to a rusted-out sedan that died 3 years ago. "I can't do this," I whispered, my voice cracking as I gripped the leather-wrapped wheel. I looked at Taeyong. A single tear escaped his eye, tracking through the pale dust on his cheek. He couldn't speak, but the sheer force of his will seemed to vibrate in the air. "Drive or we die." I slammed the start button. The engine didn't just turn over. It roared, a predatory growl that vibrated in my marrow. I found the gear shift, yanked it into what I hoped was drive, and floored it. The car lurched forward with a violence that slammed us both back into our seats. We screeched out of the garage, the tires screaming against the epoxy floor, just as the service elevator doors hissed open behind us. The city outside was a blurred watercolor of neon and rain. Chicago's winter storm had turned the asphalt into a black mirror. I swerved into the midnight traffic, the windshield wipers slapping a frantic rhythm against the deluge. Every time I hit the brakes, the car hissed and bucked. Every turn was a terrifying gamble with physics. In the rearview mirror, a pair of headlights detached themselves from the flow of traffic, weaving through cars with a relentless, hungry precision. Lydia's cleaners weren't giving up. Taeyong's breathing was becoming a wet, labor rattle. The neurotoxin was migrating, creeping toward his diaphragm. I reached over, grabbing his hand. It was ice cold and stiff, like marble. "Stay with me," I sobbed, narrowly missing a yellow cab as I drifted across 3 lanes. "Taeyong, look at me. Don't you dare close your eyes." I pushed the car faster, the speedometer climbing into numbers that made the world outside look like a smear of gray and gold. I was a waitress who didn't know how to drive, carrying a king who couldn't move, racing through a city that wanted us both dead. The safe house was a brutalist concrete bunker hidden beneath a shuttered textile factory, smelling of ozone and sterile gauze. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was terrifying, broken only by the wet, hitching struggle of Taeyong's lungs. Getting him inside was a blur of agony and adrenaline. I used a rolling gurney left in the bay, my muscles screaming as I maneuvered his stiff, navy-clad frame into a room bathed in the harsh, flickering light of industrial fluorescence. This was the cold room, a private trauma suite designed for men who couldn't go to hospitals. I slumped against the metal cabinets, gasping for air, but Taeyong's eyes found mine in the mirror on the wall. They were bloodshot and bulging, the only part of him still fighting the paralysis. A low, gravelly vibration pulled from his throat, not a word, but a command. I leaned in close, my ear brushing his cold lips. "Drawer 4, he wheezed, the sound so thin it barely carried. "Yellow vial. Catheter, line." My hands shook so violently I had to slam them against the counter to make them stop. I found the vial. Atropine. My nursing textbooks flashed through my mind, but this wasn't a classroom. This was a Mafia king dying on a stained mattress. Under his strained, whispered directions, I had to find the vein in his neck. The neurotoxin was tightening its grip on his diaphragm, turning every breath into a shallow, desperate whistle. "Do it," he hissed, his gaze locking onto mine with a ferocity that pinned me in place. "Tyla now." I wiped his skin with a shaking hand, the blue of my Waitress uniform a jarring contrast against the surgical steel around us. I positioned the needle. My heart was a drum in my ears, drowning out the rain hammering the factory roof above. As the needle pierced the skin, his body didn't flinch. The paralysis saw to that, but his eyes squeezed shut, a single groan of pure, unadulterated pain escaping his clenched teeth. I pushed the fluid in, watching the monitors. The erratic spiking of his heart rate began to level, the chemical war inside him reaching a temporary, violent stalemate. I sank to the floor, my back against a gurney, staring at my blood-flecked sky-blue sleeves. Taeyang's breathing slowed, becoming a heavy, rhythmic rasp. He wasn't saved, but he was stable. For the first time in hours, the god of industry managed to turn his head just a fraction of an inch toward me. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The way he looked at me, like I was the only solid thing in a world made of shadows, was enough. We were trapped in the dark, but for now, the tomb was open. The industrial hum of the cold room felt like a weight, pressing the silence into the corners of the bunker. Taeyong lay propped against the pillows, his body still a rigid cage of navy wool and paralyzed muscle, but his voice had returned, a ghostly, fractured rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. He couldn't lift a finger to save his empire, so he had to use mine. "The phone," he croaked, his eyes burning with a feverish, frustrated light. "The black one in my inner pocket." I reached into the expensive fabric of his jacket, my hand brushing the warmth of his chest. My pulse was a frantic rhythm against the stillness. When I pulled the device out, he stared at it as if it were a holy relic he could no longer touch. Under his strained, whispered commands, I dialed a number that wasn't saved in any contacts. "Put it to my ear," he hissed. I held the cold glass against his cheek, leaning in so I could hear the voice on the other end. It was a man named Han, his voice sharp with suspicion. Taeyong spoke in a dialect that sounded like a serrated blade, his words clipped and agonizingly slow. He told Han that he was alive, but that the syndicate was compromised. He told him that for the next 6 hours, I was his voice. "Now." Taeyong wheezed after I ended the call, his forehead slick with the sweat of the effort. "The Red Dragon, the Triad contact. You have to speak for me. They won't listen to a ghost. They need to hear a queen." "I'm a waitress, Taeyong," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to negotiate with monsters." "You saved a monster tonight," he countered, his gaze pinning me to the spot. "That makes you the most dangerous thing in this room. Call them. Tell them the docks are open. Tell them Lydia is a traitor with no backing. Lie if you have to. Buy me the dawn." I dialed the next number. When a gravelly voice answered in Mandarin, my heart stopped. I looked at Taeyong. He nodded once, a microscopic movement that felt like a tectonic shift. I closed my eyes, channeled the cold, clinical air of the Sky Lounge, and spoke. I told the man on the other end that Lee Taeyong was watching him. I told him that Lydia Gray was a walking corpse and that if he moved against us now, he would be buried with her. As I spoke the words Taeyong fed me, I watched him. He was a predator in a tomb, watching his invisible savior transform into his most lethal weapon. I wasn't Tyler Smith from the South Side anymore. I was a ghost shadow, weaving a web of lies and blood across the city, buying the man on the gurney one more hour of life with every breath I took. The silence of the bunker shattered not with a bang, but with the rhythmic, metallic clack of high heels on the concrete stairs far above. The sound was unmistakable, Lydia's signature, a cold and calculated cadence that signaled the end of our sanctuary. Taeyong's had snapped toward the door, his jaw tightening as the paralysis finally began to recede into a dull, heavy ache. He couldn't stand yet, his legs still useless weight on the gurney, but his eyes were sharp with the clarity of a cornered wolf. "She's here," he rasped, the sound like grinding stone. "Tyla, look at me. You have to be the bait." My heart didn't just race. It tried to claw its way out of my chest. The sky-blue waitress uniform was now a tattered, oil-stained rag, a symbol of a woman who no longer existed. I looked at the medical suite, a narrow, rectangular kill zone with only one entrance and a wall of heavy steel cabinets at the far end. The bottleneck, I whispered, the tactical logic Taeyong had spent the last hour drilling into me finally clicking into place. Under his low, urgent directions, I moved. I pushed the gurney into the center of the room, bathing Taeyong in the harsh, unflinching light of the surgical lamp so he was the first thing anyone would see. I felt like I was arranging a sacrificial altar. Then, I retreated into the shadows behind the industrial freezer, my fingers curling around the cold, heavy grip of the suppressed pistol he had made me check 3 times. The door groaned open. Lydia stepped into the light, her red dress looking like a fresh wound against the gray concrete. She wasn't alone. 2 men followed, their weapons raised, scanning the corners with professional detachment. Lydia didn't look at the shadows. She looked only at Taeyong, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching her lips. "Still breathing, Taeyong? You always were stubborn," she said, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. She stepped closer, drawn into the center of the room, her men fan folding out behind her just as we had predicted. They were exactly where they needed to be, lined up in the narrow space between the cabinets and the gurney. "Where's the girl?" Lydia asked, her eyes narrowing as she noted the empty space beside him. "The little waitress who thinks she's a savior?" "She's right here," Taeyong said, his voice suddenly loud and steady, a signal that vibrated through my bones. I stepped out from the darkness of the freezer, the Dutch angle of the room making the world feel like it was sliding into an abyss. I didn't think about the girl who used to cry over broken plates. I thought about the man on the gurney who had given me his voice. I leveled the barrel at the lead gunman's chest, my vision tunneling until there was nothing left but the target and the cold, hard necessity of survival. The trap was sprung, and for the first time, Lydia Gray looked afraid. The flash of the muzzle was a blinding, jagged white that seared the gray shadows of the bunker. I didn't hear the first shot. I only felt the violent kick of the metal against my palms, a shockwave that traveled up my arms and settled in my teeth. The lead gunman, the one who had looked at me like I was a piece of the furniture, didn't even have time to scream. A dark, wet blossom erupted on his chest, and he folded backward, his body hitting the concrete with a dull, sickening thud that echoed the rhythm of my own heart. The room dissolved into a frantic, blurred cacophony. Lydia's second guard lunged for cover behind a stack of crates, his weapon spitting fire that chipped the cabinets inches from my head. I dove back into the darkness, my breath coming in jagged, shallow sobs. The smell of burnt powder and ozone filled my lungs, replacing the scent of expensive orchids and wine. I looked at the gun in my hand. It was no longer a foreign object. It was a part of me, heavy and hot, a tether to a reality I had spent my whole life trying to avoid. Tyla. 9 o'clock. Tying's voice sliced through the noise, a command that overrode my terror. I swung the barrel toward the movement. The guard was flanking the gurney, aiming for the paralyzed man who couldn't even flinch as the bullets tore into his mattress. I didn't think about my father's lessons on kindness or the nursing oath I had hoped to take. I thought about the way Tying's eyes had looked when the poison first hit, the raw, naked plea of a man who didn't want to die alone. I squeezed the trigger again. And again. The guard's head snapped back, his body crashing into a tray of surgical instruments. The clatter of steel against concrete was the final note in the symphony. Silence rushed back into the room, heavy and suffocating. Lydia was gone, vanished back into the stairwell the moment the first drop of blood hit the floor, leaving her pawns to rot in the cold. I stood there, the gun dangling from my numb fingers, staring at the two heaps of wool and flesh on the floor. They weren't targets anymore. They were men I had ended. The good person I had been, the girl who stayed late to help coworkers and carefully tended to her father, shattered like the crystal at the Gilded Lotus. I felt the weight of it, the irreversible shift in my soul. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was a killer. Taeyong watched me from the gurney, his expression unreadable, a mixture of dark pride and somber recognition. He knew exactly what had been lost. He reached out a hand, his fingers finally twitching with a ghost of their former strength, and I realized with a chilling clarity that I was now part of his world. The waitress was dead. The survivor had taken her place. The iron gates of the gray estate loomed through the freezing sleet like the ribcage of a dead beast. I sat in the back of a blacked-out SUV, my fingers tracing the cold, serrated edge of a tactical knife. Beside me, for men, Taeyang's last true believers, checked their sights in a silence, so heavy it felt like a physical weight. They didn't look at me like a waitress anymore. They looked at me like a commander, or perhaps a ghost, because only a ghost could have walked out of that bunker alive. 3 minutes, Han whispered, his voice a low vibration. Lydia moved the primary supply to the upper study. If we don't get the neutralizing agent in the next hour, the damage to Taeyang's nervous system becomes permanent. I nodded, the sky blue fabric of my old uniform now replaced by matte black Kevlar that felt like a second, harder skin. I thought of Taeyong back at the safe house, his breathing a wet, rattling struggle, his eyes the only part of him still fighting a war he was losing. He had gambled his life on the idea that I could lead this. We moved as a single shadow across the manicured lawn. The estate was a monument to the Gray family's stolen wealth, marble statues and fountains that looked like frozen tears. The first guard fell before he could even draw breath, a silent, surgical strike from Han that left me staring at the blood soaking into the snow. I didn't flinch. The good person who would have screamed was buried under the bodies in the bunker. We breached the side door with a muffled thud. The interior was a labyrinth of silk wallpaper and mahogany, the air smelling of vanilla and expensive rot. "Go," I signaled, my voice a cold mimicry of Taeyang's command. The upstairs corridor became a gauntlet of suppressed fire and shattering glass. Every time a door kicked open, I saw the faces of men who had helped Lydia pour the poison, and I felt a jagged, dark satisfaction as we carved through them. We reached the study, a room of glass cases and medical-grade refrigerators. My hands, once used to carrying fragile wine glasses, smashed the lock on the central cooler. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a single translucent vial. The antidote. It looked so small, so insignificant against the mountain of bodies we had left behind to find it. Tyla, behind you. I spun, the knife leaving my sheath in a blur of movement I didn't know I possessed. I didn't see a target. I saw the obstacle between Tiong and his life. The blade found its mark, and as the guard slumped against the desk, I realized I wasn't doing this for justice or for a job. I was doing it for the man who had made me visible. I tucked the vial into my vest, the cold glass pressing against my heart, and signaled a retreat. We had the cure, but the night was far from over. The king was still in his tomb, and I was the only one with the key. The sky lounge was eerily silent, the shattered crystal from the previous night replaced by a clinical, hollow perfection. Lydia Gray sat at table 1, a glass of the same vintage wine in her hand, staring out at the Chicago skyline as if she already owned the horizon. She didn't turn when the elevator hissed open. She expected her cleaners. She expected a report of 2 bodies cooling in a basement. Instead, the heavy, rhythmic thud of polished leather on marble echoed through the room. Taeyong walked with a slight, predatory limp, his hand resting not on a cane, but on my shoulder. The navy suit was crisp again, his face a mask of revitalized iron, but it was the sight of me that made Lydia's glass slip from her fingers. I wasn't wearing sky blue anymore. I wore a coat of midnight wool, my eyes as cold and unyielding as the winter wind battering the glass. The seat is taken, Lydia. Taeyong's voice was no longer a ghost's rattle. It was a low, resonant boom that filled the vacuum of the room. Lydia scrambled to her feet, her face draining of color until she matched the pale marble of the pillars. Taeyong? I thought the girl. The girl is the reason you're still breathing long enough to watch your empire burn. I stepped forward, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had once defined me. I laid a small, digital tablet on the table, a live feed of her offshore accounts being drained, a gift from the contacts Taeyong had forced me to manipulate. Lydia looked from the screen to me, realization dawning that the invisible Waitress had dismantled her life with a few strokes of a key. Taeyong reached out, his fingers brushing against my jaw before settling at the nape of my neck, a touch that was both a promise and a claim. The air between us didn't smell of funeral flowers anymore. It sparked with a dark, electric heat, a bond forged in blood and neurotoxin. You were right about one thing, Lydia, Taeyong said, his gaze fixed on me, ignoring the woman trembling before him. The view from the top is better when you have someone you can trust. He sat in the center booth, pulling me down onto the plush velvet beside him. I wasn't serving the table tonight. I was ruling it, though the weight of the midnight-colored coat on my shoulders felt heavy with the cost of getting here. As his men moved in to escort a screaming, hysterical Lydia toward the service elevator, Taeyong didn't watch her go with triumph. Instead, he stared at the shattered wine glass on the floor, his jaw tight, a flicker of cold grief and lingering disbelief passing over his face. He had loved her once, or at least the ghost of who he thought she was, and the hollow space that betrayal left couldn't be filled in a single night. The silence of the restaurant returned, vast and suffocating. Taeyong finally turned his head toward me, the heat of his gaze breaking through his somber reflection. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of my ear, his voice dropping to a low, suggestive rumble. I told you that you were dangerous, Tyla. You have the heart of a lioness. I felt the heat rush to my face instantly, my pulse tripping over itself. I didn't lean into him immediately. I remained stiff for a heartbeat, my mind flashing back to the blood on the bunker floor and the girl I used to be. I was still grappling with the fact that I had killed for the man sitting beside me, a man who was still mourning a traitor. I looked down at my lap, trying to hide the deep flush creeping up my neck, feeling a sudden, sharp shyness that felt entirely too vulnerable for a woman holding a weapon. I only did what I had to, I whispered, my voice small but steady. I didn't give in to the comfort of his touch just yet, making him wait until I finally gathered my courage to rest my head against his navy-clad shoulder. The first rays of a cold, pale dawn broke over the Chicago skyline, illuminating us in shades of gray and gold. We weren't a waitress and a boss anymore, but we weren't a perfect couple either. We were two scarred people standing amidst the wreckage of a coup. Taeyong reached out, his hand slightly hesitant as he tilted my chin up. His dark eyes softened, searching mine for the girl who had slipped him a note, even as he acknowledged the killer I had become. He leaned forward and pressed a lingering, tender peck against my burning cheek, not a claim of victory, but a quiet offering of peace. "Thank you, Tyla," he murmured against my skin, his voice thick with a gratitude he was only just beginning to learn how to express. I closed my eyes, the warmth of his breath making me blush even harder as I finally let myself relax against him. The world was looking at us, and while the path ahead was stained with the blood of the past, for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen.
Thank you for watching till the end. Your time means a lot to us. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You are valued here. See you in the next video.